Okay, let's unpack this. We're about to do a deep dive into, well, a phenomenon that's usually just seen as crime and violence,
Mm.
the Mexican drug cartels. But what if there's another way to look at it? More strategic?
Hmm.
Maybe even like a business to understand their power, their resilience.
That's exactly what we're digging into today. We're using this really interesting case study. It suggests looking at the cartel activity in Mexico like an industry cluster, like how you'd analyze Silicon Valley or the auto industry in Detroit, but applying that idea to the illicit economy.
Right.
So our mission really is to cut through all the noise, pull out the key insights from this analysis, and try to understand why this cluster is so embedded, so hard to take down.
Right. So we're not just looking at the violence, but the underlying structures, the things that let it thrive.
Yeah.
We'll get into the basic conditions in Mexico, the geography, the people, the economic history.
Mm.
We'll look at how the government tried to respond and, well, the surprising results. And really crucially, we'll examine the cartels themselves.
Their history, how they operate differently.
Yeah. Exactly. And the elements of their business model that, frankly, make them so successful. We'll even touch on potential ways forward based on what the source suggests.
It's about seeing the whole picture, the whole ecosystem, the surprising links, and what makes them so terrifyingly durable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So where do we start? I mean, you can't really talk about drug trafficking in Mexico without talking about its most basic asset, or maybe its vulnerability, its geography.
Precisely. Mexico's location is, well, it's everything in this context. That huge border with the United States, 3,326 kilometers.
Wow.
And why is that so key? Because the U.S. is the world's biggest drug market, period. And that long land border means transport is often shorter and, frankly, less risky for getting the product straight to their main customers.
And it's not just the border length, is it? The source mentions the rugged terrain, the mountains.
Yeah.
How does that help the cartels?
Well, think about the Sierra Madre ranges. They create these vast, isolated areas. This kind of terrain can make it incredibly hard and dangerous for authorities to even get in there. So it basically gives natural cover for growing drugs, for labs, or just hiding spots for cartel operation.
So geography gives them the route and cover.
Okay.
What about the people, the human side of things?
That's the other really critical piece.
Yeah.
Mexico has a young population, yeah, but also huge gaps, inequity in education, healthcare, job opportunities. It's stark. The source highlights a pretty shocking figure. By 2008, nearly half the population lived in poverty.
Half. Wow.
And the minimum wages, astonishingly low, around what, $4.80 to 5.07 US dollars a day.
$5 a day. That kind of economic pressure must be immense.
It really is. And
Yeah.
the key insight here is how this lack of opportunity, especially for young people without skills or education, it just creates this pool of desperate labor. It pushes people towards the informal economy or, and this is crucial, towards the high-paying, though obviously dangerous jobs the cartels offer. The source specifically notes how people moving from rural areas to cities looking for work and not finding it in the formal sector that directly feeds recruitment into the black market.
So poverty and lack of options basically build the cartel's workforce.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. The national economy over time. The sources paint a picture of, well, a really rocky period.
Oh, absolutely. The decades leading up to 2010 were marked by just severe instability.
Yeah.
The 1980s, they called it the lost decade. Crippling inflation, it peaked at 152.9%.
Unbelievable.
And huge currency devaluations. I mean, imagine the peso losing over 300% of its value against the dollar in just 1 year, 1988.
And then the tequila crisis hit in 94.
Another massive shock. The peso collapsed again and needed this huge bailout, $52 billion from the U.S., the IMF, Canada. And the crucial impact there, beyond just the immediate pain, was that paying back all this foreign debt.
Yep.
It sucked huge amounts of money away from what Mexico needed internally, limiting the government's ability to invest in the very things that could fight poverty and create real opportunities. It sounds like the government was just constantly putting out economic fires instead of building anything solid.
That's a good way to put it. And yeah, there were growth spurts, sure, often tied to NAFTA or the booming U.S. economy. But the performance was really uneven. Productivity wasn't keeping up with places like Chile. The gap between richer and poorer states actually got wider. Plus, being so tied to the U.S. economy meant their downturns hit Mexico hard. The dot-com bust, 9/11, the 2008 crisis, they all caused major slowdowns in Mexico.
Okay, so summing up this whole economic picture, how did it specifically help the cartels get so strong?
The sources are really clear on this. This whole environment, poor economic conditions, constant instability, it created, fertile ground. Powerful incentives for people to turn to the black market. This directly fueled the rise of the cartels. But what's also fascinating and kind of telling is how the cartels even exploited the good economic changes.
Like NAFTA.
Exactly. Increased trade flows under NAFTA. They used that to better penetrate legal transport sectors, improving their smuggling game. They adapted and benefited from both the bad and the good times.
They really are adaptable. Okay, so with this cluster getting more powerful, how did the Mexican government try to react, to push back?
Right, that brings us to President Calderon launching the war on drugs back in 2006. The source points out his specific motivation, stopping what was mainly a public safety issue from becoming a full-on national security threat, challenging the government itself.
She went big. Military deployment.
Huge. Initially sent 36,000 troops into key states. A really dramatic step.
What else did they do? What were the main actions?
Well, they ramped up extraditions of cartel figures to the U.S. They stepped up crop eradication efforts, tried to intercept shipments with raids. There were pushes to integrate federal security forces and, significantly, attempts at public security reform.
Focusing on the police.
All right.
Corruption was a huge issue.
Massive. And the source directly links it to just incredibly low pay, about $325 a month for officers. Wow.
So they dismissed thousands of officers, tried to bring local police under more federal control, kind of borrowing from Colombia's playbook.
And there were big judicial reforms, too.
Yes, in 2008, aimed at modernizing the whole justice system. Things like a broader definition of organized crime, allowing temporary detention without charge for up to 40 days, which was controversial. Shifting from secret trials to public ones, new rules about confessions to prevent torture, trying to get equal pay for public defenders and prosecutors, exploring alternatives to jail for minor stuff.
Sounds like a lot of changes on paper. How did it work out in reality? Were they effective?
Well, the sources say implementation was really tough and slow, those judicial reforms. Estimated to take 8 years just to fully roll out.
8 years?
Yeah, and there were human rights concerns about some parts, like that extended detention without charge, plus public support for the whole military campaign. It dropped off significantly over time.
Okay, but the bottom line, what happened with violence, with cartel activity? This is where it gets really sobering. Despite this massive government effort, organized crime killings actually shot up dramatically. 34,550 between 2007 and 2010 alone. Increased. Public safety got worse. Even tourism took a hit in the northern areas. And surprisingly, marijuana production went up by almost 9,000 tons in 5 years, despite all the eradication.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. And drug-related arrests actually went down after Calderon took office. Plus, the government really didn't manage to disrupt cocaine distribution significantly.
So this major military-led war, it seems like it happened alongside a rise in violence, and in some ways, cartel activity actually seemed to increase, not decrease.
That's what the data in the sources points to. It just showed how incredibly complex the problem was. It wasn't just a military issue, clearly. It needed something much broader, probably involving international cooperation.
Which leads us straight to the United States role. The sources really stress this point.
Oh, absolutely. You just can't understand Mexico's situation without looking north. As Secretary of State Hillary Clinton admitted back then, U.S. demand for drugs is, well, it's a primary driver for this entire illicit trade. The sources estimate the cash flowing back to the cartels from the U.S. market is somewhere between $12 and $15 billion a year.
12 to 15 billion. And the source talks about the U.S. war on drugs starting way back in 71 and saying it hasn't had much success.
Yeah, the analysis notes that despite decades of effort, billions spent, the percentage of Americans reporting drug use actually went up between 1979 and 2001. The critique highlighted is that focusing so heavily on enforcement, on cutting supply, without really tackling demand or looking seriously at treatment and harm reduction, well, it basically failed to stop drug use.
And instead, fuel the black market.
Exactly. Made it more profitable, more powerful.
And it's not just demand flowing south, it's weapons flowing south too, right? Coming from the U.S.
Precisely. President Obama stated that over 90% of guns recovered in Mexico originate in the United States.
90%.
Yeah. These guns are often bought legally in U.S. states with looser laws than smuggled south. They directly arm the cartels with military-grade firepower. This massively increases their ability to inflict violence. It's a huge contrast to Mexico's own much stricter gun laws, and it's obviously a really charged political issue in the U.S., which makes finding solutions incredibly difficult.
So you've got drug demand and guns flowing south.
Yeah.
This cross-border problem led to the Merida Initiative then.
Correct. Kicked off in 2008, It's a big bilateral aid package started with over $1.5 billion from Mexico, aimed at fighting drug trafficking and arms smuggling across the border.
And what did Merida mostly focus on?
It was heavily weighted towards enforcement support, giving equipment, technology, training to Mexican forces. But it also included these longer-term goals about human rights and reforming institutions, professionalizing police, citizen oversight, legal education links. Though the sources do note critiques, like from Amnesty International, pointing out that achieving those human rights goals is a whole separate challenge from just providing the enforcement gear.
Right. So recognizing the shared problem, but the results are complex and debated.
Okay, let's shift gears now and really dig into the cartels themselves. Where did they come from? How do they operate? How have they changed?
Well, Mexico's history with drug cultivation goes way back, centuries even. The source mentions terms like gomeros for opium farmers in Sinaloa before the 1900s. But some key cartels actually trace their origins to U.S. prohibition in the 1940s. Network smuggling alcohol just pivoted to drugs.
But they weren't the huge force we see today back then.
No, their power really ramped up in the second half of the 20th century. The U.S. hippie culture in the 60s, that massively increased demand. Mexico became a major supplier, maybe also helped by the trade embargo on Cuba. Then the 70s saw these legendary figures rise up, Caro Quintero, Felix Gallardo, building these big networks, often using family ties.
And there was a military campaign, Operation Condor, that ironically kind of helped them adapt. Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? It aimed to crush production, but it also created bad feelings towards the authorities. And it pushed the bigger players to diversify into cocaine trafficking to make up for lost marijuana crops. This perfectly positioned them for the booming U.S. cocaine market. Then, when the Colombian cartels fell in the 80s, Mexico became the main transit country, boosting their power even more.
The 90s sound like they were particularly brutal based on the sources.
Very much so. You had these high-profile assassinations, a cardinal, a presidential candidate, that brought a lot more attention. But the sources also stress that by then, the link between traffickers and political power was already deep. They cite investigations into really high-ranking officials.
And heading into the 2000s.
Well, after 9/11, U.S. focus shifted a bit. The cartels faced some new challenges, like U.S. marijuana use actually declining, early legalization efforts in the U.S. failing. This changing landscape, plus internal fighting between cartels, kind of set the stage for that big government crackdown in 2006 and the violence that followed.
Okay, let's talk operations. How do they actually move the drugs, get them from A to B?
So, drugs are either grown in Mexico or sourced from Central and South America. Then they're moved in bulk towards the U.S. border. And once they get there, the source talks about these innovative procedures for smuggling.
Innovative?
Yeah, think tunnels, floating drugs across rivers, flying small planes really low to avoid radar, bribing officials, using human meals on commercial flights. It's this constant cat-and-mouse game, adapting to whatever the authorities try to do.
And the cartels themselves, they're not all the same, are they? The source mentions different ways they're organized.
That's a really crucial point. We tend to lump them together, but the big players have pretty distinct structures and strategies. Take the Gulf Cartel, based in Tamaulipas, known for extreme violence. They actually created the first big paramilitary wing, Los Zetas, made up of former elite Mexican soldiers.
And Los Zetas became this huge force in their own right.
They did. They basically militarized the whole conflict, used advanced weapons, military tactics. Their structure became more decentralized, with these gatekeepers controlling specific areas and routes. They form alliances when it suits them, but they're also known for just extreme rivalry and violence.
Then La Familia Michoacana. That one sounds really different.
It is unique, relatively new, grew really fast. Their model is described as quasi-religious, based on this strict internal code of family values.
Yeah.
It sounds bizarre for a criminal group.
A cartel with a moral code? Seriously.
Apparently. They claim they don't do sex trafficking, tell their traffickers not to use drugs themselves. One leader supposedly even published his own Bible. But while they claim it's not just about profit, the source is quick to point out they're still incredibly violent. An interesting detail, their operational security, reportedly using the same communications gear as federal investigators to fly under the radar.
That level of adaptation, those different structures, it's fascinating but also deeply worrying. Okay, let's look at the sheer economic weight of this whole cluster. How big is its impact on Mexico?
It's just immense. Drug trafficking is a huge part of Mexico's economy, even if it's illegal. Back in 1996, illegal drug exports were estimated at $35 billion. That was 5 times the value of legal oil exports then.
5 times oil.
Yeah. And by 2009, the estimate was up to $25–40 billion a year.
And this illegal money, it actually finds its way into legitimate businesses,
Hmm.
supports them.
This is a really key insight from the source. Drug money has basically propped up parts of the banking system, given it liquidity during crises. One economist estimated cartels laundered over $680 million just in Sinaloa banks, driving almost 20% of that state's economy.
Wow.
And the money gets heavily invested in legitimate things: tourism, infrastructure, spas, real estate in places like Cancun, activities that produce legal foreign exchange, which of course helps wash the dirty money.
So the line between the legal and illegal economies is just
Yeah.
incredibly blurred.
Highly blurred. And the cartels are massive employers, too. An estimated 300,000 peasants work as narcotics entrepreneurs just in the agricultural side. And employment's growing as they branch out beyond drugs. Their investment portfolio is diverse: 45% in real estate, 20% in cattle, 15% in legal businesses.
But there's obviously a terrible cost to all this.
Absolutely. The violence forces people to flee their homes, creates mass internal migration. It scares off foreign direct investment. It's hard to put an exact number on the total economic losses, but one study cited estimated potential losses could be as high as 12.3% of Mexico's entire GDP.
So a huge economic engine, but at a horrific human and social price. Okay, let's bring in that cluster diamond idea from the source. How does that framework help explain why the cartel's business model is so successful?
Okay, yeah. So think of how you'd analyze any industry cluster. The diamond looks at four main things that are all connected. You've got input conditions: what resources do they have access to? Demand conditions: who's buying? Then the context for strategy and rivalry: how do they compete and operate? And finally, related and supporting industries: what other sectors help them out?
And government policy kind of sits over all of that.
Exactly, influencing everything. So starting with input conditions, what advantages do the cartels have?
Okay.
Well, easy access to labor: those poor, often uneducated, sometimes fearless young people, especially in struggling cities like Juarez. They're desperate for cash or just a sense of belonging. Geography gives them that crucial transit route. The sheer profitability of drug transport is another massive input.
Yeah.
And the fact it's all cash-based gives them incredible liquidity.
Demand conditions seem pretty straightforward. It's the U.S. market, right?
Right. Massive, unrelenting demand from the U.S. It just dwarfs domestic demand in Mexico. That's the fuel for the whole operation. And when facing pressure, they've even strategically expanded distribution by directly supplying U.S. street gangs and prison gangs.
Okay, what about the context for strategy and rivalry? How do they deal with each other?
The source uses this great term, frenemies.
Frenemies.
Yeah, they're brutal competitors, right? Fighting violently over territory groups. But they also form strategic alliances when it suits them for security, for efficiency. It's this really complex dance of savage rivalry and cold calculation.
And there's an ironic quote the source uses here.
Yeah, it quotes JFK talking about U.S.-Mexico relations. Geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies.
Okay.
Those whom God has so joined together, let no man put asunder. And the source applies this, maybe a bit darkly, to the cartels, suggesting their potential unity is their biggest strength, even though rivalry often gets in the way.
And corruption, listed as a main strategy.
Absolutely. It's maybe their single most effective tool for creating a good operating environment for them. By corrupting officials, federal, state, local, they get intel, they disrupt their rivals, they minimize interference. The source mentions one political scientist claiming 17 out of 31 Mexican states were corrupted at one point. Just shows the scale.
And their operational tactics, like smuggling methods, that falls under strategy, too.
Definitely. All those flexible, constantly changing ways they get drugs across the border, splitting loads, tunnels, different vehicles, even using women with clean records to move guns. That's all core strategy. Designed to evade detection and keep the product flowing to, reportedly, over 230 U.S. cities.
And violence itself is a strategy.
A brutal one, but yes, strategic. Used to scare off competitors, silence the media, intimidate communities, get revenge. From their viewpoint, it's a tool of the trade to maintain control and market share.
Okay, moving to related and supporting industries, what else feeds this cluster?
Well, agriculture, obviously. Providing the raw materials, marijuana, opium poppies, the U.S. firearms industry is critical, supplying the weapons, fueling the violence. Remember that 90% figure?
Right.
The global pharmaceutical industry, especially where regulations are weak, like parts of Asia, supplies precursor chemicals for synthetics like meth. Production largely shifted to Mexico after the U.S. cracked down, and the construction industry is a key partner for laundering all that cash.
And government policy is the backdrop to all of this.
Yep. All the government's actions, Merida, The reforms, anti-money laundering laws, military operations, and they're all part of the context that cartels operate within. The government tries to disrupt the cluster, but faces this incredible resistance and adaptation.
So if you put all that together, the inputs, the demand, the strategy, the support industries, the policy environment, why is their business model, just looking at analytically, so successful, so resilient?
The source lays out some really compelling reasons. First, their main goal is crystal clear: make money, maximize profit. Second, they are incredibly adaptable. Think about shifting marijuana, growing into U.S. public lands to compete directly with U.S. growers. That's adapting.
Yeah.
Their sourcing efficiency is just off the charts. Buying pot for, say, $25 a pound in Sinaloa and selling it for $550 in Phoenix, the margins are just staggering.
Those profit margins are unbelievable.
They really are. They use sophisticated growth strategies, expanding internationally into Europe, using Africa and Spain as gateways, moving operations to friendlier places like Guatemala when needed. They balance alliances with rivals against, well, violent acquisitions is just taking rivals out. They understand risk versus reward. They'll take on high-risk things like cutting out middlemen and cocaine deals with FARC for huge potential profits. Their logistics are constantly fine-tuned, smuggling cash physically in cars because electronic transfers are tracked now, using mules for small gun shipments.
And their marketing. You wouldn't think.
It's not traditional, but it works. Word of mouth, personal selling, aggressive distribution networks right down to high school kids sometimes, using the lure of material wealth to recruit people. Their global reach is huge, and the product itself being illegal, addictive, highly desired, that drives its own demand.
Their networking ability, especially plugging into the government, that seems like a massive advantage.
It's incredibly powerful. It lets them penetrate government at all levels. The sources mention cases like an extradited ex-governor, and that whole public debate sparked by a journalist's claim unverified. The source notes about a pact between former President Calderon and El Chapo Guzman.
Right.
It just highlights these serious, persistent questions about high-level political involvement. The sources handle these claims carefully, noting where they're unverified, but show the perception, the debate about this deep connection.
And they even do a kind of corporate social responsibility. That sounds crazy.
It does sound counterintuitive for, a violent criminal group. But the sources describe them stepping in where the government fails, providing jobs, social services, donating to churches. In some places, locals actually see them as heroes, as businessmen of the year funding social projects. This gives them a kind of social legitimacy, protection within certain communities.
It builds loyalty.
Exactly. The sources talk about a strong identity, a culture that fosters employee loyalty even when doing terrible things. They even have a patron saint, Jesus Malverde, this sort of Robin Hood figure. His shrine gets donations, locals worship him. It reinforces how integrated they are into the local culture.
And the sheer number of people they employ is just vast.
It's incredibly labor-intensive. You need people for farming, guarding, processing, transport, security. The source cites one estimate: 468,000 total employees.
468,000.
Yeah. Potentially making the drug industry the fifth biggest employer in Mexico, bigger than the state oil company Pemex, bigger than the army. And these workers at the bottom, they often reinvest their earnings locally, buying cattle, building houses, which pumps more money back into the legal economy.
Their distribution is mostly wholesale, aimed at U.S. gangs.
Yeah, primarily focused on wholesale distribution to gangs across the U.S. They often try to stay neutral in U.S. gang wars. They use advanced tech automatic weapons, even IEDs. Competition is fierce, and they actively try to disrupt rivals, sometimes even by leaking info to the government about them.
So, okay, even though it's illegal, they operate with this surprisingly sophisticated, adaptable, resilient business model. The source says they value reliability, quality, competitive prices within their illicit market, which leads to this huge controversial question the source raises. Given all this, could Mexico actually benefit from legalizing drugs, integrating this industry into the official economy?
It's such a complex debate, ethically and practically. You've got the victimless crime argument for users who consent versus the horrific reality of innocent people caught in the crossfire of the drug wars. The sources really try to lay out both sides.
So what are the main arguments presented for legalization?
Well, a big one is tax revenue. A huge industry, estimated at $13 billion a year. That could be taxed, like a sin tax on tobacco or alcohol. That money could fund education, development programs, maybe even keep legal prices high enough so a black market doesn't just pop up again.
And it would free up money currently spent fighting the war.
Exactly. That massive enforcement budget could shift to social spending. And there's the hope for a dramatic drop in violence, less fighting over turf, fewer kidnappings, murders. If legalization lowered cartel operating costs, maybe it would even push them towards legality.
Could it help other parts of the economy?
Potentially. Maybe tourism could benefit, like in places with more liberal drug policies. The banking sector might see foreign deposits return. And just legalizing marijuana alone could hit cartel revenue hard, since it's estimated to be a huge chunk of their sales, maybe 60% plus. Less violence could also attract more foreign investment, maybe slow down the migration forced by conflict and lack of jobs. And legalization could be framed as a way to control product quality, reduce the harms of an unregulated black market.
Those are some significant potential upsides. What about the arguments against legalization, the big risks the source brings up?
Well, a major concern is just the economic shock of dismantling such a huge illegal industry. Can Mexico actually afford to lose all the income and jobs the cartels currently provide, however illicitly? Then there's the challenge of public perception. The cartels have deep roots, respect in some communities. It's hard to fight them when locals see them as legends, almost glamorous figures.
And legalization might look like the government is endorsing drug use.
Yes, that's a fear. Could it actually lead to more drug use, more negative social impacts, maybe even more crime committed by users to fund habits? The source mentions the cautionary tale of Zurich's Needle Park, a supervised injection site that eventually had to be shut down because crime and pollution spiked in the area around it.
And what if the legal price just can't compete with the black market profits?
That's a huge risk. Even with taxes, the legal price might still be too low for the cartels compared to what they make now. And why would they give up their other profitable illegal businesses? The ore smuggling, extortion, kidnapping. Legalization of drugs wouldn't stop that?
So yeah, a really complex balancing act, weighing potential economic and social gains against some really serious risks and unknowns.
Absolutely. It involves tough, practical, ethical, and political choices. And the sources acknowledge it's a conversation political leaders really need to be having.
Okay, so based on this whole analysis, what policy recommendations does the source put forward? And thinking like the cartels, what are their likely future moves?
Policy-wise, the source suggests hitting corruption hard, maybe starting by seriously boosting police salaries to cut that incentive for bribery. Another big one. Take that massive drug war budget and invest it in creating legitimate local industry clusters. Provide alternative, well-paying jobs. Basically, compete directly with the cartels for workers.
Build real alternatives.
Exactly. Getting political consensus is seen as vital for any consistent long-term policy. Improving education is key financial incentives to keep kids in school, training centers for different skills, promoting entrepreneurship, maybe using microfinance, especially in rural areas, to help people build legitimate livelihoods.
And the U.S. role needs to shift, too.
The source suggests the U.S. could rethink the heavy enforcement focus of things like Merida, maybe divert more funds towards education and job training in Mexico instead, and fundamentally, changes to U.S. laws on drugs, guns, and immigration are probably needed to really change the game, though the source is realistic about the huge political obstacles to that in the U.S.
Right. Now, flipping it around, thinking about the cartels themselves, given their history, their adaptability, what does the source suggest they might do next?
Well, based on how they've always adapted, the source figures they'll likely keep exploiting and expanding their distribution networks, maybe getting more into retail inside the U.S. They might try to move production closer to the markets, use more tech to avoid getting caught, and keep diversifying into other crimes beyond just drugs to boost profits and spread their risk.
And keep trying to influence the government.
Yeah, probably step up efforts to penetrate government at every level, maybe using more strategic bribes and deals alongside the violence. The source even throws out the idea they might create more hidden, decentralized structures, almost like an Illuminati type thing to make sure the business survives, even if visible leaders get taken down.
And if legalization actually happens.
The whole history presented here suggests they'll just adapt. They'd find ways to navigate or exploit whatever the new legal reality is.
So this analysis paints a picture of a cartel cluster with a business model that's just incredibly tough to beat. Demand doesn't quit, they're amazingly adaptable, and this whole illegal industry is tangled up so deeply in Mexico's economy and society. The source calls it a potential turning point for the country.
It really highlights that tackling this means facing not just crime, but basic socioeconomic problems, systemic corruption, and these huge transnational forces driven by U.S. demand and guns.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows there's so much more to the Mexican drug cartels than just the violent headlines. Seeing them through the strategic cluster lens is crucial for understanding how deep and resilient this challenge truly is.
It really underlines that just focusing on enforcement isn't enough. You need this multi-pronged approach hitting the root causes, the systemic issues. But man, that is incredibly hard to pull off.
So, considering how adaptable the cartels are, their massive economic weight, and how limited the success of current strategies has been, does legalizing drugs, despite all the controversy and risks, represent maybe the only realistic way to fundamentally change the game? Or they're completely different strategies, maybe ones we haven't even thought of, focusing way more intensely on cutting demand worldwide or tackling poverty and inequality on both sides of the border in a radical new way that could actually work? Something for you to think about.